Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Strategic International Studies. Thank you for joining us today for our event on a report launch for a report called Transforming European Defense. We are joined today by our three panelists, Max Bergmann, who is one of the co-authors of the report. Max is the director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program here at CSIS, as well as the Stewart Center in Euro-Atlantic and Northern European Studies. Prior to this, Max was at the Center for American Progress, working on the same issues, Europe, Russia, and Eurasia, and U.S. security cooperation. Max has spent years at the State Department in a variety of roles, focusing a lot on political military affairs, non-proliferation, and particularly relevant for today's conversation, arms control and international security. Max is also my co-host for the Europhile podcast, which is run out of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program. Next, we're joined by Marie Jourdain, who is a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Prior to this, Marie was in the French Ministry of Defense Director General for International Relations and Strategy for the North America desk, focusing on U.S. defense policy with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Crucially, she was involved in fostering U.S.-France strategic defense talks, so we're going to have a lot to talk about on this today. And she's also worked on countering illegal drug trafficking through regional cooperation in the Caribbean, French Joint Staff on military cooperation with the U.S. and the U.K. And speaking of the U.K., last but not least, we have Sean Monaghan, who is a visiting fellow in the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at CSIS, working on NATO, European security, and defense issues. Sean has spent years as a civil servant in the UK Ministry of Defense, focused on international defense policy, including NATO, the European Union, the United States, all also very relevant for today's conversation. And in recent years, as a policy analyst, he has contributed to the UK's integrated review and has led multinational research projects. So this is the panel that we have today to talk about this report. But importantly, to set the stage a little bit, the Transforming European Defense is a wider project that has seen several other briefs published over the last few months, run out of CSIS to run by the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program in partnership with our colleagues at the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at CSIS. The goal of this project really is to leverage CSIS's interdisciplinary strength in transatlantic affairs, in political military analysis, and defense industrial engagement to create a plan of action to rationalize European defense in the wake of the war in Ukraine. The goal is also to develop specific recommendations for European policymakers to reduce inefficiencies and seek creative joint endeavors for European security. There are also actionable recommendations for U.S. policymakers in how they can engage with and push some European allies to implement some of these changes. So that's the frame for the report. It is co-authored, as I said, by Max Bergmann and our colleague Otto Svensson. There are two key pieces to this argument, and I'll turn to Max in a second to explain this, but the idea is that one, European defense has suffered over the last 20 years of underinvestment and fragmentation, attributable to several factors that we will discuss today. And two, the European Union is an actor that will be crucial in this challenge to work on coordination and integration efforts in defense for Europe. Max, let me start with you. This report is a labor of love. It has, you've been working on this for a while, and it is as relevant today as it was when you started on this effort. So walk us through the key takeaways for this report. Let's focus first on the main vulnerabilities that you highlight in the report for European defense. What are their causes before we move to the U.S. role and solutions from the EU?
Well, first, thanks for moderating, and it's great to be here with great colleagues and friends. I think the report actually comes at a very good time to do an assessment of European defense, not in the months after Russia invaded back last year, but we now have some time. We've had a year plus to really assess the state of European defense, to also understand what European forces are giving to Ukraine, and also the threat landscape that will present itself for Europe, both when it comes to Russia, but also other threats and challenges. When you look at European defense, what you realize is that it isn't very European. It is European defense is done by nation states and member states in Europe and within NATO. And NATO is a member state-driven organization, and that makes a lot of sense. That was the how NATO was created 74 years ago. It's about to have its 75th anniversary next year, and defense was seen as the domain of the nation state. The problem is that NATO has been successful, right? Where for many European states, the threat to the nation is actually, there isn't really one. If you take your country like Belgium, Belgium faces a lot of security threats, but most of them aren't necessarily of the national military domain. They are law enforcement. They are protecting the European institutions that are in Europe. But they're not needing to sort of protect Belgian airspaces from a French or UK or German invasion, hopefully not. And this is also true for many Western European countries. And so what you see is this sort of cacophonous landscape throughout Europe where you see countries like Poland now spending close to 3% or above 3% on defense, seeing the urgent threat by Russia. A country like Greece spending 2%, but not because of really NATO obligations, I would say, but because of a threat by another NATO country, Turkey. And so you see these very nationally driven focus on defense. But what that means is that there's a lot of gaps when it comes to European security, when it comes to European defense. And we as Americans tend to look at Europe and say, why aren't the Europeans getting their act together? Well, that's not how European defense is designed to do. It is designed so that nation states spend what they're going to spend and then contribute what they can contribute to NATO. NATO then coordinates everything together. And what we highlight in this report is that the major question here is, what does the U.S. actually want from Europe? And this is, I think, the penultimate question that maybe I'll just go into now, and then we can, because so the report, after the introduction, the first section it highlights is, what does the U.S. want from European defense? Now, on the one hand, I think most listeners would come to this question and say, well, of course, we want Europe to be able to handle stuff, that it's not as dependent and reliant on the United States to handle every little thing, and that we can, European militaries can step up, get their act together. This has sort of been the rhetoric that we've seen from countless presidents. On the other hand, actual U.S. policy, what we point out in the report, is to preserve the indispensable role that the United States plays in European defense. We actually like that European countries are dependent on the U.S. to conduct military operations. We get very concerned when we see EU efforts or efforts at the European level for Europeans to get their act together, to spend on European defense companies, not to spend on American defense companies. We have more influence in Europe than any other region of the world, in part because of Europe's reliance and dependence on the United States. And so there's a debate playing out. There are really good foreign affairs articles from people like Mike Mazar from Rand Corporation saying, we actually get a pretty good deal with NATO. Kathleen McGinnis, also here at CSIS. And then there's others, many from the restraint crowd, restraint community, Emma Ashford and others who've written in foreign affairs, arguing that actually we want Europe to be more autonomous, more independent. And I think what this report tries to do is lay out, well, okay, I think we do want Europe to be more autonomous, to be stronger, to be able to do things without us, to handle itself, both because the United States is going to be focused on the Indo-Pacific. But that's going to take a long time. And we need to begin the process of pushing Europe to integrate its forces more, to develop its forces together, to buy together, to cooperate more together. And that's a long-term generational approach. So we sort of see that debate and try to maybe, I don't know about finding a middle ground, but basically to say that we can't just rip a Band-Aid off. This is going to be a slow process, but we need to have a strategy that is about wanting Europe to be stronger and more capable actor in the world.
So you mentioned the problem is NATO has been successful. In the report, you address how NATO has played a role itself in not necessarily driving this fragmentation, but not contributing to integration and cooperation. Can you dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, look, when NATO was founded, the European community or the European economic community did not exist. But what we've seen over the last 30 years is there is a union. And what we've also seen over the last decade is when that union has come under threat, that the EU has responded, and to paraphrase Mario Draghi, has done whatever it takes to protect that union. whether that's buying vaccines together so Germans get vaccinated at the same rate as Bulgarians, or taking strong stance on migration, sometimes even potentially violating human rights. The EU has taken action, and Sean can attest to that when it comes to the UK, that is acting more like a union. And this is a new development in Europe. And so that's happening at the same time defense is to remain, and we're having this argument about defense just being the domain of the nation state. Well, right now, nothing is just the domain at the nation state. And what NATO has demonstrated that it can do quite effectively, I think, is coordinating all these forces and somehow creating an integrated fighting force. What NATO has not done, and which our report argues, is having those countries, those national ministries of defense that all have their different procurement agencies, these 27 or different pentagons, to cooperate together when it comes to spending the money. So Europe doesn't build its forces together. Hence, it's no wonder that there's big gaps when it comes to airlift, when it comes to air tankers and air transport. And so that is, I think, a major problem. What we point to is the role the EU can play here is do what it does, which is integrate sectors. And so when it comes to defense, it should be trying to integrate how Europeans buy. And what that means, and the big pill that the United States would have to swallow in supporting the strategy, is it means if the European Union is going to spend money, and it has the fiscal capacity, it has the ability to generate resources, it has the euro, the currency, it has an ability to borrow money on capital markets, something that NATO does not have, something the European Union did in response to the pandemic, then it means that Europe is going to spend money on European defense companies, not American defense companies, or much less, it's going to spend more on European companies. And that's fine. And I think that's actually going to be somewhat beneficial to the NATO alliance as a whole, because a strong defense industrial base in Europe could be beneficial to us in the long run. I think Ukraine is demonstrating the importance of having a strong European defense industrial base as well.
That's fine, but it probably depends on who you're talking to on this side.
Sure.
But since we're now on the subject of the European Union, Maria, I want to turn to you. You've heard the crux of the report. I'm sure you've read it as well. There have been conversations for years about whether the EU should do more, how to collaborate better with NATO, on also just years and years of conversations, at least from the US side, of how much more Europeans should do. What is the view from Europe on this, especially when we're having conversations about having the EU do more? Do you see member states being open to this? How do they view this conversation when it happens in the US?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm very privileged. Actually, it's very interesting because the question here in the US, you mentioned, Max, is does the US want to remain indispensable to European security? The debate in Europe is not so much on that. It's definitely more like how do we make sure that we remain the ally the United States wants, because of course the US is going to be the indispensable partner because of the nuclear umbrella. And so the question is on that, and this is where the strategic ambiguity of the United States is playing out. Because depending where you are in Europe, you're not going to answer the same way, because the United States send mixed signal between, yes, we want you to do more, and at the same time, but please don't build a European defense technological industry base. And you know, don't misalign with us, because we want to preserve the transatlantic unity. And so depending on where you are in Europe, you're not going to answer the same way. In many countries, if you fear that the United States is reluctant on any European-led defense initiative, you're not going to push for more ambitious moves, because your priority is not on this integration, it's not on making European stronger, is to be sure that the United States are going to be there when the time arrives. And so in other countries, like in France, because for many reasons you have a different policy, the answer is the same. We want to have the American there for us, but the strategy is going to be different. It's going to be a good ally for me is to invest in capabilities. It's to be able to lead operations that the United States don't necessarily want to lead by themselves, etc. And so I think to have a change in that, for make the debate move forward in Europe and at the EU level too, is to stop having strategic ambiguity of the United States on European defense.
I think it's really interesting the way you framed it, that I think maybe we miss sometimes on this side, which is integration is not necessarily the priority on the European side, is ensuring the partnership with the United States and retaining that close alliance as we hear constantly the move to the Indo-Pacific, et cetera. But as I hear this, I keep wondering, what about all these conversations, I guess 2 years ago, of strategic autonomy? Is that dead? Is there any political will for it left, or just France maybe?
I think the issue with strategic autonomy that we focused for way too long on the terms. And because we framed it in the wrong way, the basis of the debate is wrong. We framed it in either it means like actually having strategic autonomy means to distance ourselves from the United States. And never, we consider the strategic autonomy as much more global. And also, the way, like, maybe we need strategic autonomy when we have to be facing China or other adversaries. And so we focused way too much on the terms because we want to make sure that it doesn't, antagonize. It's not going to antagonize the United States. So strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, strategic responsibility, strategic intimacy. I love it. And it's so many terms. But at the end of the day, what happens is that we don't talk about the problem it's supposed to address. At the same time, the Europeans and the EU have done for much more on strategic autonomy in the past 5 years than we would ever have imagined it. And I think, in a way, the United States have every interest to embrace that and to make the most of it. For instance, the EU-US security and defense dialogue that is not set up for a year or two now. Also to make sure that coordination and cooperation is still very much ensured. And yeah, to maybe stop the debate on the terms, but actually address the challenge, because what was sustainable 20 years ago, like European dependence, was probably sustainable 20 years ago. It's not today.
And we're seeing that more and more every day. So, Sean, let me turn to you for a little bit. Conspicuously absent from this conversation so far is the United Kingdom. If we're talking about the United States, about the European Union's role in filling some of these gaps, where does the UK stand in all this? Understanding they are indeed in NATO and the relationship with the United States remains very close. Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, came recently. So the relationship here is positive, but how do you see the cooperation working out? Where can the UK play a role in this effort, given the current state of the relationship with Brussels?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say thanks, Donatien, for having me on. It's been great to discuss some of these issues in your excellent podcast, the Eurofiles. So great to do so in person with great colleagues and friends too. To your point, well, let me start with strategic intimacy. I hadn't heard that one before.
Me neither.
I know we've got a special relationship with the US, but I didn't realise the French had strategic intimacy. There you go. Write that one down. I think Marie is right on the point about strategic autonomy. I think actually the language used by the Biden administration, a stronger, more capable European defence, is the right language. The issue is, what does that mean in practice? And this is where I think Max and Otto's report and this whole series of reports, two of which I've authored myself, aim to kind of help thicken that. What does that stronger, more capable European defence actually mean in practice? But maybe we'll get to that. First on the UK, directly to your question, and thanks having me as a kind of token non-European, non-EU member in the room. Look, the UK has left the EU, but it's still in Europe the last time I checked. And if you read the UK's integrated review, which we refreshed We seem to be refreshing it every 6 months. But we refreshed it in March, and it has a very large section on how important Euro-Atlantic security is to us, how important European security is to us. It even mentions the European Union 3 times, and we're not even members. Clearly, the current government in the UK, the policy is basically not to have a formal relationship, a security arrangement with the EU's defence and security arrangement. That may change in time. There are elections next year, but the UK has a very strong relationship with the EU, with Europe. The Integrated Review Refresh has a very large section, which I commend you to read, on all of the things that the UK has done since it's left the EU to strengthen bilateral ties with partners, including France. So I think the UK shares the interests of all of its European partners to have a stronger, more capable European defence. As I said, the question is how do we do that? I think where certainly London and Paris differ slightly, and London and Washington are kind of on the same page here, is that the kind of institutional division of labour, if you like, between NATO and the EU, which has kept think tankers and academics in jobs for many years, has been an erstwhile feature of European defence and security. Max mentioned the European Economic Community. After World War II, there was a European defence community, which was actually proposed by none other than Winston Churchill, which amazingly was shot down by the French at the time. But in time, we got to the Saint-Malo Agreement between Jacques Chirac and Tony Blair in 1998, and we have this European defence identity and policy. But I think what Ukraine has kind of showed us, and Europe's response to Ukraine, is really, if NATO didn't exist, you'd have to invent it. NATO is there as the primary security guarantor of European defence. However, as Max and Otto point out in their report, there is a lot more that the EU can do. The EU, as an institution, has levers that NATO does not have. It has fiscal, regulatory levers that NATO does not have. So I think what Max and co are saying in this report, particularly to US policymakers, but also those in London too, is that maybe it's time for a more nuanced approach towards the value that the European Union can add on this goal of a stronger, more capable Europe that everybody shares.
Certainly, and if we're focused on outcomes, that's where the solutions should be found, wherever they lie.
Exactly.
But you mentioned some of the briefs that you've written for this project, and we actually interviewed you about one of them in March, where you wrote that Europe has a dilemma. It is spending more on defense but cooperating less, which I think goes directly to the heart of some of the issues that this report brings to the surface. You also talked of strategic cacophony, which is an excellent term for what we're discussing today. Yes, next to strategic intimacy, although slightly different meanings. Why don't let's dive into that a little bit and how that plays into the challenge that we're dealing with today on this broader level, and Max's report mentions this. What did you observe in that brief that relates to the challenge at hand?
Sure. So thanks for bringing the report up. The report, Europe's Defence Dilemma. So what is Europe's Defence Dilemma? Well, it's simply that, European nations are spending more on defence, and they have spent around a third more on defence since 2014, since Russia's annexation of Crimea. Defence spending has risen. At the same time, defence cooperation between European nations has declined. I mean, this is quite a striking trend, that spending's going up, but cooperation is going down. It's kind of opposite to what you'd expect. Where's that money going then? Well, a lot of it's coming over here to the States. So a lot of European nations are implementing a kind of Buy America policy. Now, this makes sense to some extent. So air defense systems, say, for example, there's US systems off the shelf, Patriot, NASAMS that are being procured, fighter jets, F-16, and so on. There's a lot of US equipment that is ready to go, that is kind of proven and of the very highest standard, that Europe is buying to fill the gaps that exist in Europe. But as kind of Max points out, this is maybe not the most sustainable solution when we're thinking in the long term how to sustain, as Marie said, a European defence industry and a European military that is, whether it's autonomous or not, is beside the point. How strong is it? How capable is it of deterring future Russian aggression, deterring Chinese economic coercion, and so on? This is the key question. So the fact that European nations are not cooperating with each other, or cooperating with each other less, so less multinational joint acquisition projects, less multinational R&D, those exist, and the EU has instruments to help encourage more cooperation. The European Defence Fund, the EDIRPA, the European Defence Investment. Never mind what it stands for, but the point is it encourages joint procurement and research and development. But the sums, and Max can probably talk to this, the sums are quite small. We're talking 500 million here, $1 billion there. It's a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of defence procurement, it's not much. So there's more juice for the squeezing there to encourage cooperation.
So speaking of many European initiatives, Marie, I'd like to turn to you on this. Is the flurry of European initiatives that we've seen over the last few years a boon to this effort to coordinate more on defense? Is it a potential hurdle? Because we've seen political, economic, and administrative level potential challenges, but also opportunities at the European level. So how do you see this among all of these initiatives that we've heard about and acronyms that we've long forgotten?
Well, thank you. First, let me say that we had EU-driven initiatives, but also non-EU but European initiatives that actually bring also back the UK and with other European countries, or like the JAF. So there's these two tracks. What the EU defense initiatives, why they're not delivering as much as we would like to, is that they're not ambitious enough. And why they're not ambitious enough, for different reasons, but coming back also to the messaging from the United States. But what I thought was very interesting in the past few months was, for the very first time in March, you had an Estonian-led initiative to jointly buy ammunition for Ukraine. And that's very specific, that's very new. And the United States was actually much more positive in terms of narrative and language. And in a way, it pushed the Europeans to do more and say, okay, so let's be ambitious. What else can we do? The second issue on the industrial capacity, is that most of the time, the Europeans don't think that industries can do it. How many times did I hear, well, we need to buy to the US or to turn to Israel or South Korea or whatever, because I don't believe that our industries can. And then when you look a bit more into depth, the European industries are there and they say, yeah, we're not working full capacity right now, despite the war in Ukraine, despite the shortfalls in capabilities, because they didn't have the orders. So these are also the questions that are at stake, and what I think in the report really underline and in a very important way is that national government decide, keeping in mind with the interests of the national industries. It's absolutely what the Americans are doing. The issue is that the EU is not a country, and so. What the EU can do is really, to give the incentives, because it's not a zero-sum game. It's actually added money. Like, contrary to NATO, for instance, where anytime you have to increase the budget of NATO, you have to take it from the Ministry of Defense budget. So it's a choice you have to do. It doesn't make that you shouldn't do it. It's just like it's not added money. When we reinforce the budget of the EU in defense and in security initiatives, the budget you take is not coming from the Ministry of Defense, it comes from the envelope you give at the EU level. So it actually gives more money, and this money is adding up to whatever NATO can do or national nations can do. And this kind of, initiatives in a much more positive narrative can really help, I think, to have more ambitious initiative. But my concern, in a way, is I would like sometimes to hear from DC, why are you not more ambitious? Instead of, what about the interest of my industries? Why are there restrictions there? Why cannot I benefit from EU taxpayer money? And this is what we have heard for many, many years. We're not surprised, but I would like, 500 million for a joint procurement and incentivization, yeah, sure. It's nothing. Mm-hmm. It's not enough.
No, the scale is too small, certainly. Mm-hmm. And I want to pick up on the thread that you just threw out on the U.S. approach to this. But first, you mentioned the European defense industry, and I wanted to turn back to you, Max, actually, on this. When it comes to scaling up to the level of ambition that you would like to see, or the report calls for, especially with the assistance of your EU funds for this, one, can those companies in fact scale up from what we're hearing from them if they get the political and financial commitments from EU governments, European governments, that the equipment would be needed and purchased once manufactured? And can they compete with the American defense industry if they do decide to do this?
It's a great question. I think the answer is yes and no. I think there will be moments where if you're a country like Poland or Eastern European countries that have given away their Soviet era fleets of tanks, suddenly you're looking at your tank inventory and said, we need tanks tomorrow, and who can build them? Well, the Koreans can build them quickly. So I think there's going to be there's a genuine dilemma where buying off the shelf, proven technology, versus, the Europeans have a tank that they're working on in development, the future tank. But there's also the ability to just procure the Leopard tank as is and get those factory lines moving. So I think there's going to be a bit of both. I think to Marie's point, I think that this is exactly right, that the United States has been very parochial when it comes to these EU defense initiatives, that instead of us going and saying you borrowed for COVID, you should borrow for war and invest in defense to the EU, we haven't done that. President Biden went to the European Council last year and didn't make that point. And instead, we're still sort of, we need access. The U.S. needs access to these potential funds. We need this administrative arrangement with the European Defense Agency, even though the EDA doesn't even really do a lot of contracting. It's more, and I get it. I was in the State Department. If you're in the State Department, if you're in the French Foreign Ministry or UK Foreign Ministry, you want to support French companies, you want to support UK companies and US companies. And that is what we do in Europe. But there's a larger strategic question at play here. And I think that is really critical because we're at a really pivotal moment. European militaries are in disrepair but there's suddenly this will and willingness to try to do something about it. And so we're seeing increased commitments to increased defense spending. Well, maybe not all of those are going to be reached. I think many of them will be. So we're about to see a lot more money being injected into European militaries. And as Sean mentioned, over the last decade, we actually saw increases in European defense. American presidents going on, and it wasn't just Donald Trump, American presidents going on and saying spend more on defense. And the Wales Pledge from 2014 has, I think, worked. European defense spending increased. But what happened to European defense overall? I would say you had marginal increase because you had marginal increases in defense spending spread out. And so what we're arguing for here is that, Otto and I, what we're arguing for is that the United States should put as much emphasis on defense integration, on defense cooperation amongst Europeans as it does on spending more. So as much as we're saying spend more, we should say you should do it together. Why doesn't Europe have certain capabilities such as airlift and refueling? You should be investing together to figure out how to deal with that. And the irony is that actually defense cooperation tends to increase when defense budgets go down because countries become desperate to figure out how to maintain their defense forces. So we see Dutch-German integration happening in the naval domain because suddenly they don't have the manpower to operate the ships. And I think there's a danger that actually European defense cooperation gets worse because suddenly defense budgets are flush. And so this is where the EU with $500 million to incentivize joint cooperation is not enough money. And the US should be saying, do more, do more, do more, but do more at the European level to incentivize the necessary cooperation.
And that's very connected to the brief that you published, Sean. And I think for me, it was particularly helpful reading it because some of these statistics I'd never really encountered before, and I think they're very striking when you think about the trajectory for the last 10 years. But you wrote another piece for this overarching project on specifically air defense and shortfalls in the defense realm. Where do you see the capabilities needed for strategic interests in Europe? And I'd also love to tie with the UK defense industry as well. Where do you see the role that the industry has in cooperating with EU industries, for example? Are there already projects that we can point to for future examples?
Yeah, got you. Okay. Well, let me start with the point about cooperation in the previous report, the Defence Dilemma report. So cooperation is very difficult, and the report goes into many reasons why this is. It's essentially a collective action problem where nations are incentivized to do the best thing for themselves. The tragedy is if they all work together, they'd all be better off, right? And, look, cooperation is difficult. We came up with a few ways of maybe enhancing cooperation using institutions like the EU and NATO, which, don't forget, are designed to reduce the friction of cooperation. And we came up with kind of three big ideas. One, more cooperation between small groups of nations, small groups of like-minded nations that already work together. Marie mentioned the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, 10 Northern European nations that work together. Nordic defence cooperation is already quite high. In Southern Europe, Central Europe, there are countries that often work together. So use those small groups. Cooperation doesn't have to be at 27 or 31, soon to be 32. Number two, kind of normalize cooperation, make cooperation a political priority. This is something that the EU has done very well. The Versailles Declaration last year in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually put cooperation right at the top. It wasn't just about assisting Ukraine, but it was about EU nations cooperating with each other to provide that assistance. I think NATO could do the same. We've got the NATO Vilnius Summit on the horizon in a couple of weeks. There wasn't much, as Max's report points out, there wasn't much in the Madrid summit last year on cooperation and capability cooperation. I think NATO needs to do more. It already does a lot. I mean, there are 18 or so high visibility projects on some of the areas that Max mentioned, but I think NATO could do more to prioritize cooperation. And then kind of showing leadership and doing things like naming and shaming countries that don't cooperate with each other. The EU, again, they produce very detailed figures on which nations cooperate. There are some flaws in those figures. We go into those in the report. NATO it produces defence spending figures, but doesn't go into too much detail on cooperation. So there's more to do there. On the air defence problem, which we produced this report on European Sky Shield, you mentioned as a kind of a case study on a new cooperation initiative. It's German-led. It was announced last year by Chancellor Scholz as part of the Zeitenwende, this new era of defence. It features in the German national security strategy that was released last week. But it's quite a complicated initiative with 17 nations, and by my estimation, there's been no multinational cooperation initiative with 17 nations that has ever succeeded. It's usually a handful of like-minded nations. And now we have another kind of competing French-led initiative. I don't think it's competing, but it kind of seems that way. Perhaps Marie could tell us more. But there's a French-led air defence initiative and this German-led Sky Shield thing, and there's a lot going on there. Other areas of capability, well, previous CSIS reports have covered this in some detail, but basically Europe doesn't have Europe kind of reaped this peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. And Europe doesn't have the mass to deter the high-end conflict. It relies on the US for that. European nations can field, Marie used this phrase earlier in conversation, but bonsai, so-called bonsai armies, small but perfectly formed. Europe needs more mass, it needs high technology, and it's good at that. But ultimately, Europe needs more mass, more high-end capabilities, more warships, more tanks to deter the very kind of conflict that we don't need, that we don't want to fight. And finally, the UK industry on this. Well, UK industry is global in outlook, and that includes Europe. I take MBDA as an example, which has a British arm, an Italian arm, and a French arm. They work together. Sometimes they don't. They work on separate airborne air defence interceptor missile projects. For example, the UK is working with Poland through MBDA UK. France and Italy, I think, are working together. So there's some cooperation there, but it could be better. Another example is the GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program. So the UK has got this program with Italy and Japan, actually looking at future kind of combat air unmanned. There's also a European program looking at the same thing. So again, there's some healthy competition there. But look, UK industry is part of the picture. There's no reason why the UK shouldn't cooperate on any of this.
And you mentioned Vilnius coming up next month. Clearly, this is on the minds of a lot of people at NATO as well. We saw a recent meeting with 25 major Western defense companies to address capacity issues for what they call battle decisive munitions and equipment. So there are positive moves here. There's an understanding of this need for rearmament, but inevitably other companies came out to complain that they were not invited. That includes, I believe, Boeing and Dassault, or major defense companies. But probably both a question for you, Marie and Max. Do you see this being in the same vein of fragmented approach, or is this a positive step that NATO is taking to try to start bundling some of these industries, some of these companies, to focus on very specific needs, as you were mentioning, for example, the Estonian proposal for specific kinds of ammunition? Where do you see this kind of effort lying on the road to better integration? Perhaps let's start with you, Marie.
Sure. I think initiatives like may they come from NATO, from the EU, from coalition of states, it's fine as long as we talk to each other. And the issue for which has been for a very long time, for instance, is the EU does what it does, NATO does what it does, and sometimes we do not talk to each other, and we might actually do things that are in competition in a way that should not have been. We have to take what NATO can do in a very, like, what NATO is good at, what the EU is good at, and make them talk. And the challenge, and you mentioned it in the report, is NATO-EU cooperation has been stalling for years because of diverging interest with Turkey. And as long as we don't solve that, we don't, like, NATO-EU cooperation doesn't become a priority, that we think that doing a statement without a roadmap is enough. I don't think initiatives, whatever they are we going to maximize them? And so that would be really my priority in order to avoid more fragmentation. And in a way, I don't think we're going to head anywhere if we don't make it a priority anytime soon. And it comes also at the highest level of responsibilities. I think it will be very important to have in NATO and in the EU at the top level people who know both organizations, because they know they can maximize and I need to talk to Secretary General because he can leverage on this. If we talk about critical infrastructure, I will talk to the EU because they can actually have the project on this, etc., etc. And so that will be my point on this.
Yeah, I think, look, NATO-EU bureaucratic rivalry is sort of well known, that there's, immense distrust between the two institutions. It sort of reminds me a bit when I started at the State Department in 2011 of state DoD rivalries, and there was sort of suddenly this effort to get over that and expand cooperation, but it's incredibly unhelpful, and in some ways it's ridiculous that the idea that the EU and NATO are in competition and rivals to each other when they have I think 24 EU members, or soon to be, will be part of NATO. It's 95% of the EU population is in NATO. So we're talking about two institutions, NATO and the EU, that have the same membership, effectively, at least in a European context. But what I think we're seeing is that the EU does have a role to play in defense. And even if you didn't think it did, the EU debates that are happening right now when it comes to fiscal policy and whether to return to the Stability and Growth Pact, which will set deficit levels and force European countries to reduce their deficits, well, that means you're not going to see a lot of defense spending. So you could argue the most important conversation on the future of European defense isn't going to happen at Vilnius, but it will happen between EU finance ministers that aren't at Vilnius. So the idea that we're going to separate these two, and I think this is part of the problem we see with European thinking, is that defense ministers go talk to NATO and the leaders do, but then everyone else on the domestic side of the house just focuses on the European Union. And so you have this kind of disaggregated approach when it comes to defense and security, oftentimes within Europe. I think it's great that NATO is doing that. I think other NATO initiatives, the Diana initiatives, the NATO Innovation Fund, all make sense. But the EU also has also R&D related initiatives, and I'm not worried about duplication. What I am worried about is the lack of coordination, and that's where, because the EU is an actor, you have to coordinate with it. And I think part of that is getting over the U.S. getting over some of its concerns. But then Marie points to the Turkey-Cyprus problem, which is, Cyprus is part of the EU, Turkey's part of NATO. This is a real dilemma, but it's never prioritized as this is something that we need to get over. And I think once Sweden gets over the line, hopefully, that this should be next on the priority list. I think the one other thing I would just maybe highlight here is that we're not talking about the EU creating its own army, right? So throughout, we're more than 30 minutes into this conversation, no one has been like, the EU is going to create its own army. And we're talking sort of about the nitty-gritty of defense procurement. And part of this is because this is, I think, critical for Europe to build a cohesive defense capacity. But this involves nations working together. And I think what we would see is that over time, the EU could have a greater role when it comes to coordinating defense forces. And you could see a situation very soon, where the EU, which already conducts peacekeeping missions, crisis management and response missions, deciding that, it needs to take action in a North African country. It needs to act, let's say, in Sudan to prevent maybe a humanitarian crisis. And that's something that NATO may not want to do, because the United States may say, we're not going to focus on the Middle East and we're not going to do those sorts of missions anymore. But the EU, seeing migrants come into the European Union, may decide this is a threat to the EU, that the EU is beginning to have interests of a global power. And especially when trade and economic policy are done at the EU level, and increasingly migration policy, you start to see the EU starting to need to act to defend its own interests. And this is where I think if NATO is constantly resistant to the EU being a defense actor, it's going to threaten NATO over the longer term here. And I think that it's figuring out how to minimize unnecessary duplication. But, having worked with the Pentagon a lot, there's a lot of duplication at the Pentagon, and it exists for a reason. You don't want to have gaps. You want, different entities to be able to do things and respond and not have seams. And right now there's a bit of a seam that who acts for Europe if the United States isn't going to? It's not clear.
And the report, to be fair, makes very clear the goal is not to create a European army or a single force. It's to help forge a European pillar within NATO. I think if we were actually talking about European army, everybody in Washington would have a collective aneurysm. But even
and in London. By the way, that was Winston Churchill's idea originally, the European army. I mean, he had a lot of good ideas, plenty of bad ones. I think that was one of the bad ones.
The U.S. was also, John Foster Dulles went to the NATO Council and sort of demanded the creation of the European defense community. It's long been, the U.S., the Eisenhower vision was that there was going to be a European military, and it was the French who objected. And frankly, I think if that were to happen, if that were to be on the table, I think the biggest obstacle actually, and this is not to attack the French, but it would be the French, in part because the French have a national military that is capable. And so you're going to have these different variances of interest in working together, and that's fine. But it's about trying to encourage cooperation where it can.
But even several steps removed from a European army, you said we're just talking about the nitty-gritty of defense procurement here. That's not a small thing.
No, it's not a small
to have this
thing.
conversation in Washington. And I want to turn to the U.S. side, because we've talked at length about the U.K., about the EU, about NATO. But the elephant in the room here is the U.S. approach to this entire effort. And you've talked about this at the beginning as well. But I want to dive a little deeper into this. Is the EU's rise as a defense actor is not going to be possible without U.S. support, without engagement with a lot of these governments. But How do you see a positive U.S. role playing out in this situation? And how do you see addressing some of the potential concerns that exist in the Pentagon, to some extent in the State Department, to a stronger European defense industry, to more euros going to European companies and not American companies?
Yeah, so look, in some ways, this is super easy, what we're suggesting. This is not,
great, you fixed it.
I'm not calling, this report, Otto and I don't call for the United States to suddenly buy, 5 more aircraft carriers and spend all this money. This is literally about a shift in diplomatic messaging. And the idea here is that this is essentially the card that the United States hasn't played on European defense. And it may not work, right? Calling on the EU and the Europeans to start doing more together may not lead to a big transformation. But I think, as Marie mentions, is that we lower the ambition of the European Union when it comes to defense because there's an assumption that the Americans will be against it. And even when we're not that vocally against it, oftentimes we're sort of behind the scenes, hey, we really need access to this. And we oppose things very sometimes bluntly, which happened a number of times during the Trump administration with EU-wide initiatives, or sometimes quietly, which has happened at times during the Biden administration, where we express concerns quietly. And I've heard that from European sources and American sources. And so I think that the shift here is saying we want Europe to get its act together, and we actually mean it. And we want the EU to do to spend more, to leverage its ability to borrow, its currency, its fiscal capacity, its large budget, to incentivize cooperation. And we don't care if Europeans buy more, and they do that by buying European. And then what we want NATO to do is to make sure that we all have the same standards. Because one of the things that the war in Ukraine has demonstrated is that, not all 155 millimeter mortar rounds are the same. And there's actually a reason for that. Sometimes they're newer and older and you make improvements. So standardization is sort of sometimes a moving target. But I think we would want UK munitions to be able to go on American platforms. So if we were in the Indo-Pacific in a contingency with China, and there's a Taiwan war game that was done by Mark Hansian here at CSIS that noted that we would run out of munitions very quickly and we'd get our factories going here. But look, we have Europe, which has 450 million people, which has this huge economy the equivalent of size of the United States and China, that can also produce munitions and other items that would be vital for any broader conflict with China. So our 2 defense industrial bases is a huge asset. And so really it's about shifting the focus, and to instead of this being kind of a parochial focus on maintaining our access, how do we get Europe to be stronger, to be more capable, to maybe do separate military operations in the Middle East or North Africa where we don't want to be, and encourage that. So maybe that's the EU creating its own command structure. Maybe it's the Europeans buying European. But this is where the United States being a productive actor. Right now, we're not really trusted when it comes to European defense because we've been so against it for so long. So shifting to being more pro-European than the Europeans, I think, is where I'm advocating. And this is not necessarily a new thing. The last thing is, I love this quote, but Konrad Adenauer, the first German Chancellor of West Germany, came out of Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State's office, and said this is right after the early days of the Cold War, said, Americans were the best Europeans, i.e. we are more pro-Europe than Europeans. And I think this is particularly the case when it should be the case when it comes to defense. And we want European nation states to work together much more than their national ministries of defense oftentimes want them to.
When you wrote in a foreign affairs article that you co-wrote actually with our Carnegie colleague, Sophia Besch, on very similar topic, you see a lot of this action potentially taking place within the State Department. And you mentioned a diplomatic shift, although you made it sound very easy. I don't know exactly if it is that easy, but that they should consider the impact of U.S. arms sales on defense industrial base of the NATO alliance. But are they equipped for this, and what are the incentives for this in the interagency process, thinking about the Pentagon as well? Because, there's a saying that in trade and economics in the United States, we don't pick winners and losers. I don't know if that applies to the defense industrial base, but... So
my role in the State Department was oftentimes going to European countries to say, you should buy American. And I think those countries probably made some good choices. But on the other hand, if they decided not to buy American and buy French, wouldn't have been the end of the world, right? In some ways, the strategic benefit that is gained in the United States by selling to Europe is not equivalent to selling to India or countries in Southeast Asia, where we're trying to build diplomatic relations and partnerships. We're already in alliances with these countries. So the diplomatic, just from a foreign policy perspective, there's other gains, benefits from economies of scale. So if countries are buying more Patriot, then it lowers the per unit cost. But to me, we need to start taking into account the weakness of the European defense industrial base and view it as a strategic priority for that to become stronger. And that doesn't mean we argue against U.S. companies from making a sale, but it may be, we don't need to make it as dire to diplomatic relations with said country if they don't buy said weapon system, because, Article 5 doesn't get any stronger if you, buy U.S. weapons or not. It's not in the clause. So, and I think making that, but that I think will be difficult. And what I sort of understated is that, look, U.S. policy for the past 25 years has been that the EU is an adversary when it comes to defense. The EU shouldn't do defense. That has been, Madeleine Albright sort of laid that out. Don't duplicate NATO. And that has been adopted as sort of doctrine in the State Department for 25 years. But it's viewed as ridiculous inside of Europe that the idea that the EU is this challenger to NATO. And I think that's what we need to get over. And getting over that is a big challenge, because every time the United States sort of hears the word strategic autonomy, we think, oh, this is divorce. And we're so quick to be paranoid about the future of transatlantic relations that we just want to always sort of preserve the status quo. And so there's this sense that, no, the United States is pushing Europe to be stronger. Actually, we're really seeking to preserve the status quo. And I think that that's what we need to not be afraid of, is change when it comes to transatlantic relations, I think will be positive, because the direction that the EU is going is actually more alignment to the United States. And we see that with the relationship between von der Leyen and Biden, especially over China. The EU is more aligned with Washington, Brussels, than many member nation-state capitals, including Paris, including Berlin as well. So actually more alignment with Brussels, I think, would actually make our lives easier, and it's not something we should be afraid of.
And if I can build on this, on the messaging, I think I'm all for this change of messaging, but also to be very careful in the way we deliver it here from the US to the Europeans, because the concern sometimes you will hear in Europe is that if we actually become stronger, the United States will leave because we will be able to do to ensure our own security. And that is the nightmare for a lot of European countries, actually. And so I think in the way of the phrasing coming from the State Department of Pentagon would be, I need Europe to be stronger, not because I want to be out, but because it's a condition for me to stay. And if you had these clear messages, I think a lot of the countries, especially East and Central member state in Europe, will actually, okay, so I feel confident, let's go, because my biggest fear is having the U.S. Out. And also, I think in terms of organization, what really struck me when I was back in Paris and interacting with in the Pentagon with OSD policy, you don't have within the European section EU experts. In Europe, basically, when you talk about European defense in the United States, you hear NATO. So you don't hear EU. You don't see the EU having a potential role. And so whenever you have to build an initiative, a coalition, whatever, you're going to go through NATO because you don't have anyone who will maybe, oh, by the way, the EU is working on this. Maybe that would be good to coordinate. No, this will be, back in Brussels. And so you also have to think in terms of organization, having the people who, share the same desk and on NATO and the EU, and this is synergies there. Maybe we could, talk about that. Very concrete, very practical steps. And finally, what you said about, the Article 5 is not about buying capabilities from the US. It reminds me of a conference of former Minister of Defense, partly at the Atlantic Council in 2019, when she mentioned that Article 5 is not Article F-35. And that really resonates today, because I think you're right. I think it's a great point, but I think it will be fooling ourselves if we ignore the fact that a lot of the Europeans also buy American military equipment, not because they necessarily need, not basically because this is what makes the most sense. It can be, of course, but it's also because it reinforces from the European perspective, the transatlantic link. And so this is why I really think this change of messaging is necessary from the US.
Let me turn to you briefly, Sean, and then we'll do one final rapid-fire question.
Yeah, just to make shock you, but I agree 100% with Marie. For the record,
we have fixed it. There you go.
Yes, there are too many NATO heads in this town. There's not enough people like Max. Max is an outlier who is familiar with EU defence. I myself worked a joint policy desk job on EU and NATO policy, and I recommend that kind of system. I think more people in DC that understand EU and the entire landscape of European defence, which is much more complex than just the EU, clearly, would be a great thing for DC. And on the Article F-35 point, it's a flippant point, but actually F-35 is a great example of a project which was the biggest defence project in the history of the world, which was designed to be multinational. The UK makes about 10% of the parts of the F-35. So if the US does this right and has a smarter policy towards European defence, European acquisition, it can benefit more from co-development, co-production, exports, and kind of more strategic intimacy with European defence and industry.
That is going to be our new thing. Sure. So final question for all three of you, and I'll start with you, Sean, and then we'll end with you, Max, for closing words. Is looking ahead, now that we have a couple really big milestones coming up for the alliance, how can allies, the US and all the EU members that will be at Vilnius, leverage both Vilnius and then next year, the 75th anniversary, looking if they all share the effort, the goal that is outlined in this report?
Yeah, this is a huge moment, because of the war in Ukraine, but also because, look, for Europe, for the transatlantic community, the US strategy has been pivoting towards China for a while. China is the pacing challenge, quoting the National Defense and National Security Strategy. China is the focus. We all kind of live and work here. It's all about China. Europeans need to understand that. This is what's changed. This is what's structurally different from the kind of post-World War II period, is that the US has its eyes completely on China and the Indo-Pacific region. Therefore, it's in the US interest and in Europe's interest to kind of step up on a stronger, more capable defence. Vilnius and the 75th anniversary summit next year will be crucial, I think, on defence spending and NATO deterrence commitments that were made in Madrid, making good on those too.
Great, right?
Yeah, very quickly. I think either in Vilnius anniversary, like Washington Summit, but also lower levels, EU-US security defense dialogue, like to leverage as much as possible to move forward the debate, not questioning, is the EU and NATO are truly complementary or not. I think we must pass this debate, as the Ukrainian war actually shown that the EU can do stuff. They can do training of Ukrainian troops. They can deliver weapons, things that NATO couldn't. At the same time, NATO has never been as strong, and the EU has never been as strong. And so, really, to capitalize on this moment, to maybe be a bit bold, and also having the Europeans to play finally collectively, and stop. I'm such a great ally, look at the United States, like I've done that for Ukraine, or I've done that for whatever. But instead of saying, me France, me Spain, me Greece, me Poland, say us, Europeans, we've done that. And that will also, give the incentive, I think, for the United States to consider the Europeans as Europe and not just as individual member states.
I think that's a great sentiment, that the EU has never been stronger and NATO has never been stronger, and the two can be stronger together. And I think one of the things that that we haven't talked about is what do Europeans want? And one of the things that we highlight in the report, just to close, is that you increasingly see this in polling across Europe, that Europeans want EU defense because they get that the threats to their security aren't, and this is for most, this is widespread, whether it's in Eastern Europe or in Southern Europe, but particularly for those in Western and Southern Europe, that the threat isn't really to the nation, but to Europe. And they want their Europe protected. And so when the threat isn't to their nation, but to their Europe, the idea of spending more on defense at an EU level just makes fundamental sense. And it doesn't go against NATO. And I was in Madrid last week, and you actually, heard sentiment of actually it'd be easier to just spend more at the EU level than it would be on the national level because there'd be greater public support for that because, there's history in Spain when it comes to their defense forces that is complicated. And so this notion that, defense has to be done and invested on at the national level is not actually the case, especially when, if you're 30 years or younger, you spent your whole life as an EU citizen. And that means a little bit more, it's a different context and meaning than it was perhaps in the 90s when the last time the U.S. really reckoned with a lot of the future of European defense and European security issues. So I think that's number one. And the second thing I would just say is the support for Ukraine, I think, is pivotal. And while we're talking sort of long-term issues of trying to strengthen European defense over the longer term, the short-term reality of needing to sort of ramp up defense industrial production through ammunition to support the Ukrainians has to take precedence right now. And I think that that's where a lot of money needs to go. And through that process, I think you're seeing European defense strengthen because it's creating this sort of muscle memory of how Europe can actually work together. So thank you.
That's a great way to end it. I want to thank you, all of you, panelists, Jean, Marie, Max, for joining us. The report, once again, is Transforming European Defense, a New Focus on Integration. It also has been published along with a lot of other briefs, really interesting from visiting fellows, from our colleagues in the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group. So we encourage everybody to go to csis.org to read all of these amazing reports to get even more meat than what we had in the conversation today. But this remains a crucial issue for the transatlantic relationship, for Ukraine in particular, looking ahead to next week's summit in Vilnius, or the week after, and the next year, the 75th anniversary of the alliance. So if you want to hear more of this in the next few weeks as well, Max and I am sure we'll be talking about it a lot on the Europhile podcast, but please continue to engage with CSIS. I am sure there will be a lot more work coming your way on these issues. And thank you all for joining us.